Hey guys, Trick here, hope you're having a good one. Now that GPUs are starting to crawl back into stock and their prices are starting to trickle down back to those MSRP levels, I figured what better time than to finally do a PC build guide. But we're not going to do just any PC build guide, we're going to make a next generation console killer. Now, just over a couple years ago, we made our $600 budget PC build where we put 1080p and 60 FPS to test with a bunch of different games and a bunch of different settings. But over the past couple of years, we've gotten some new GPUs hitting the market, and more importantly, the next generation of consoles have brought the performance up to the next level. So for today's video, the stakes have changed and we have to up our game when it comes to performance while still managing to stay in a pretty competitive price bracket compared to some of our previous builds. So without getting into the weeds, let's get to the parts lists. At the top of the list is going to be our CPU, and all of the current generation consoles have access to Zen 2 based CPUs. Now at the desktop platform, we're currently at Zen 3 CPUs, so if we want to match the spec precisely, you're going to have to go over to eBay and pick yourself up a 3700X. That way you can match the 8 cores and 16 threads that all of the different consoles have. Now there are a couple different alternatives you could pick to put into your console killer, but we'll be talking about those later in the video. Next up is memory, and for the consoles, they have to share their entire memory pool between their video solution and their system RAM. And on the desktop, we can buy both our DDR4 memory as well as our video card with their own included memory. So if you do the math for the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox, we really only need to have access to 8 GB of additional memory. Now, since memory prices are really cheap and I'll probably get flamed down in the comments, I recommend you guys pick up 16 GB of DDR4 3200, but if you're really strapped for cash, you will be able to run at 8 GB of memory, but you will see some reduced performance. With the motherboard, there's only really one specification we have to keep in mind in order to match the next gen console specs, and that is having access to PCI Gen 4. Now that spec is going to be critical in order to provide enough bandwidth for our GPUs as well as our storage solutions, so you're going to have to pick up either an X570 or a B550 motherboard. Now we're not going to be needing to overclock or go all out when it comes to the different features like Wi-Fi, extra phase counts, and all those other things, so a budget-based B550 would be a pretty good fit here. Now, if you're wanting to go with a small form factor build, I would recommend going with a mini ITX build like I've gone here, but micro ATX or full-size ATX will work out just fine. Alright, now let's talk about the soul of our console killer, and that's going to be our GPU. And this is where we're going to get the most deviation because we have to cover all of our bases from the lowly Xbox Series S all the way up to the mighty Xbox Series X. Now, in order to match these consoles as close as I can get, I'm going to be sticking to RDNA 2 based GPUs. That way we can match the same architecture as well as the relative T-flop performance scaling that we've seen in a lot of the different videos we've covered here on the channel. Now for the Xbox Series X, we need something that's going to equate 52 compute units running at 1.825 GHz. Now the closest comparison that I've come up with is the RX 6700 XT, and it runs with 40 compute units clocked around 2.5 GHz. The RX 6800 does seem like it would be a better fit since it's running 60 compute units, but it's also running at a faster clock speed than our Series X. So for our comparisons today, it would be complete overkill. We've talked about the PlayStation 5 a lot here on the channel, and we need access to 36 compute units operating dynamically up to 2.23 GHz. Ideally, there would be an RX 6700 here like we covered with our analysis of the MSI Delta 15, but alas, no such GPU exists. And just like we talked about with the RX 6800, using the 6700 XT in this instance would just be overkill for our comparison. So that's where the RX 6600 XT comes in, and it's going to be running 32 compute units, and it's going to be running all the way up to about 2.6 GHz. So having a few less compute units but running at a faster clock speed should give us about equivalent performance. Now the runt of the next generation consoles is the Xbox Series S. Again, the 6600 is just too good for this comparison, and it's running with nearly double the T-flops compared to the Series S. And unfortunately, that leaves us with the lowly RX 6500 XT, with 16 compute units running at a blazing 2.8 GHz. Now, in theory, this GPU should work out because it's running at blazing fast speeds compared to the Series S, but as we've seen across the internet, the 6500 XT only has access to 4 lanes of PCI, which actually reduces its bandwidth and will actually impact its performance quite a bit. And of course, it only has access to 4 GB on its VRAM buffer, and that's going to hinder it quite a bit, especially with these next generation titles. One thing that I'm really impressed with the upgrade to the next generation consoles is we no longer have to use spinning rust hard disks, and we get access to blazing fast NVMe storage. Now for our builds, all we have to do is pick up a 1TB NVMe Gen 4 drive in order to match both the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. If you're wanting to save a bit of cash, you can pick up a 500GB NVMe Gen 3 drive and it'll work effectively just the same. But if we're going to keep consistent with our video, you've got to match the spec, so PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, you got to go with the Gen 4 drive. As for the rest of the system, you can get pretty creative. All you're going to need is a case, a power supply, a CPU cooler, and any of the other accessories you want to build in with your console killer. Now, a couple different recommendations. For the power supply, if you're going with an Xbox Series X or PlayStation 5, I recommend a 650 watt 80 plus gold. But if you're going with an Xbox Series S, you could probably get away with a 550 watt. But I do recommend going with 80 plus gold. That way your efficiencies will be pretty good. Now the case I picked for my personal console killer build is from Silverstone. It's a small form factor. I'll show some shots here in the B-roll, but it's extra slim, extra light, and I'm going to be taking it with me to all the different LAN parties this year. But honestly, as long as your components all fit in the measurements, any case will do just fine. And since we're not going to be overclocking our CPU, pretty much any cooler is going to work pretty well here, like a Hyper 212 or even the AMD Wraith Spire or the Prism coolers. Those will work for this build just fine. Now, I'm going to be posting all of the PC part picker lists down in the description below. That way you guys have a template to build your console killers off of. Feel free to comment over there or let me know down in the comments what build you're going with and what different tweaks you put into your parts list. With all of those parts picked, let's talk performance. Now, measuring the performance in this video is going to be a little bit different than our traditional benchmarking videos here on the channel because, comparing, frames per second versus the different systems, it's just not the way that these consoles are built. They're all built towards different quality settings and frame rate targets, and I've got to match some sort of standard to do that. In order to get that information, I've done a whole bunch of research and I've validated all of the settings with all 3 of the different graphics cards, and I've used a lot of the foundation built by Digital Foundry. I'll post a link down below to the playlist I've collected where they talk about the different resolutions, the different frame rates, as well as the different quality settings used for all the different games. Now, I'm not going to be diving through all the individual settings in this video, but I will be highlighting what I had to use in order to match their settings in all the different consoles. Our first target today is going to be the Xbox Series X, which is arguably the most powerful console of this current generation. We're going to be taking a look at Forza Horizon 5, Doom Eternal, Cyberpunk 2077, as well as Halo Infinite. Forza Horizon 5 is going to be considered our gold standard when it comes to the Xbox Series X today because Digital Foundry got the actual settings from the developer themselves for both the quality mode as well as the performance mode. Now, I'm going to be sticking with the performance mode in our testing because that's going to hit 4K at a locked 60 frames per second with relatively high detail settings. Now, I love Forza Horizon 5 because their built-in benchmark is really good and it's actually very stressful, and in most cases more stressful than the game itself. And sure enough, with all the settings in place, we're able to get a locked 60 frames per second throughout the entire benchmark run. And when we go into gameplay mode, we maintain a locked 60 frames per second from our storehouse down by the beach, all the way through the jungle and ending up at the Forza Horizon Festival. Doom Eternal is a well-optimized game, and for us we have 3 different gameplay modes. We can play with ray tracing turned on, performance mode where we aim for 120 FPS, and a balanced mode where we try to maintain a high resolution while maintaining 60 FPS. Now I'm going to be testing performance mode because I find that running at the 120 FPS limit is very challenging for all the different consoles today. With a target resolution of 1800p while engaging dynamic resolution scaling, we're able to run ultra detail settings across the board, and we are going to be hitting 120 FPS for the most part. Now, if you look up at the top right of the screen, you will see a percentage sign next to our output resolution, and whenever that drops below 100%, that's when DRS is in fact engaging. But with the RX 6700 XT, even at 1800p, we don't see DRS kicking in all that often. So I would consider this a win for our console killer. Cyberpunk 2077 also has 2 different modes, and I'm focusing on performance mode. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to kind of decipher the quality settings that are going to be used. I'm going to be using Alex B's optimized performance settings. I'll post the screenshot here, and it's running anywhere between high and low settings for the most cases. Now, the output resolution is 1782p, and unfortunately, at least in my testing, dynamic resolution scaling on the PC just didn't work out all that well. But for our 6700 XT, we're able to maintain above 60 FPS for the most part within the benchmark, and going into real gameplay within the first sections of the Street Kid mission, we do in fact maintain above 60 FPS. So overall, I'd say this is a strong result. Halo Infinite has 2 different video settings for us to choose from: quality mode that aims for 4K with DRS enabled, and a performance mode where it goes to 1440p and targets 120 FPS. Halo Infinite's performance mode is exceptionally challenging. We have to drop our resolution down to 1440p and still engaging dynamic resolution scaling, but we are able to maintain 120 FPS in all of our gameplay today, and I gotta say that is really impressive, especially from the king of the next-gen consoles. I've talked about the PlayStation 5 a lot here on the channel, and we're going to shake things up with a couple of different games. We're going to add Control as well as Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Now in Control, it looks like we're actually going to be using a lot of low detail settings across the board, and the main difference between the performance mode and the graphics mode is disabling the different ray trace selections. Both video modes are targeting 4K display output, but I only have access to 1440p as my render resolution, so I don't exactly line up with the actual console. Though with the 60 FPS target in performance mode and all of the matching quality settings, I am able to maintain a solid 60 FPS within the first few sections of the game, and to be honest, I think we could even increase some of our quality settings just a little bit. Doom Eternal is exceptionally difficult for the PlayStation 5 in the performance mode, where we match the quality settings and the frame rate target as the Xbox Series X. In order to hit that, the PlayStation 5 has to go to 1584p, but on the PC, we don't have access to that specific setting. So I'm going to be using the next step down from 1800p and still enabling DRS. Now, the unfortunate result from this particular test is we do in fact engage DRS quite a bit. But keep in mind, we are using a different output resolution than the PlayStation 5. So with all things considered, I would say that this is a great result, especially considering we're using the 6600 XT. Cyberpunk 2077 matches the same quality settings as the Xbox Series X, but we do have to use 1728p as our output resolution. And again, just like we saw in Doom Eternal, we do see DRS, or at least we want to see DRS triggering in order to get a solid 60 FPS, but we just don't see that materialize with this specific version of the PC. I really wish that developers would better support some DRS solutions, but we are able to at least trigger down to 1440p in order to get a locked 60 FPS. Last up is Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and this was a launch game for the PlayStation 5, and surprisingly, it is using really high quality settings across the board. And in fact, in some of the Digital Foundry videos, they showed settings that were even beyond what the PC was able to present. Now, there is a DRS solution built into the PC release, but it doesn't really work as well as what's on the console. So I did have to taper down my output resolution in order for DRS to hit that 1440p lower resolution target. But for this PlayStation 5 equivalent GPU with the 6600 XT, we do hit about 60 FPS on average, and when we go into actual gameplay, it looks like we're hovering anywhere between 54 and 60 FPS. So I would say this is a pretty solid win, though I would recommend overclocking your GPU just a little bit when it comes to the memory interface and TDP if your situation allows. All right, next is the Xbox Series S, and guys, it's been quite a challenge. I really wish I didn't have to do it, but in order to show you guys just how to build this particular console, I had to run into a few different challenges. And first and most obvious is, of course, PCI Gen 3. Now, in my case, I didn't realize this when I was building it, doesn't support PCI Gen 4. It's going through a riser out of the motherboard and then a riser to go into the extra compartment in the case, and it just doesn't support PCI Gen 4. So in all of my testing today, I've been running it PCI Gen 3x4, which is anywhere between 10% and 20% slower than what would actually be delivered. So let this be a warning to you guys if you're building an Xbox Series S. Definitely get a case or risers that support Gen 4, because it was a lot of head scratching and a lot of frustration that I had to do for this video. And the next thing I saw was, since I'm running in Gen 3 mode, I saw a lot of memory contention when I was running in the 8GB configuration. So again, if you're going to be running in a system that's running this particular config, definitely go with 16 gigs of RAM. It helped alleviate a lot of the headaches I was seeing. But if you're going with the PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series X build, the 8GB should be just fine. But despite the headaches and all the testing that went into this video, I think that this configuration matches the essence of what we're trying to accomplish with these console killers, and it actually lines up with a lot of the frustration that Digital Foundry had in a lot of the analysis they did. Doom Eternal was our first struggle bus, and at performance mode, we're still supposed to target 120 FPS at the ultra quality settings, but unfortunately, we just don't have enough VRAM buffer to manage the ultra preset. Even if I dial back the memory pool size down to medium, Doom Eternal just hammers the PCI interface, and we are just struggling across the board with our limitation on the Gen 3 interface. So I dialed back settings down to medium settings, and I was able to get between 60 and about 110 FPS across the board. Unfortunately, if I wanted to get that locked 120 FPS experience, I had to set my display resolution down to 720p, which is a far shot from the performance mode that the Xbox Series S is able to achieve. So I think we're just running into the limitations of this specific build, and if you go with Gen 4 PCI as well as 16 gigs of RAM, I think you should be in the ballpark of a good time. Halo Infinite is another struggle bus for this particular build, and we ran into the same texture size limitations. Running with the same settings as the Series X as well as the PlayStation 5, we have to dial back our texture sizes down to medium settings, and even then we still ran into instances where we would hover anywhere between 40 FPS and 70 FPS. So dialing everything down to medium, restarting the game, and actually hardwiring our output to 1080p, and at that point we were finally able to manage a locked about 110 to 120 FPS. But I do want to mention that Digital Foundry also had some challenges when it came to the Series S, and they rarely were able to hit 120 FPS locked, especially in the outdoor scenarios. So given all of the caveats that they put into their video and the limitations of our current system, I think we're actually in the right ballpark. Forza Horizon 5 is our saving grace in this comparison today, where we are able to get pretty much the same performance and quality settings as the Xbox Series X as well as the PlayStation 5. The only settings we had to dial back were the texture quality settings from ultra to high. Now we are running at 1080p and targeting 60 FPS, and in the benchmark loop we're only able to get between 45 and 55 FPS on average. But keep in mind though, DRS doesn't really work inside of Forza Horizon 5, and if we go back to Digital Foundry's analysis, they saw that the Series S was hitting DRS quite a bit. So I gotta say, given their results and our performance numbers, and going into some real world gameplay, we're lining up pretty well with the Series S. Given all the performance we've reported as well as the video I've captured from the actual builds themselves, I gotta say all of our console killer configs have actually lined up pretty well with their equivalent consoles. I think the 6700 XT build actually surpasses the Xbox Series X, and the 6600 XT is right in the right ballpark when it comes to the PlayStation 5. And as for the Xbox Series S and the 6500 XT, I'd say we're just on the cusp of being right on the mark, because given our Gen 3 issues we were seeing and some of the memory compatibilities, I think if this was in the right chassis, I think we would be just right on target. But that begs the question, if you're not wanting to go with AMD for your builds, or you're trying to upgrade your current PC, are there any alternatives we could substitute in these lists in order to get to a pretty equivalent experience? The heart and soul of our build is going to be the GPU, and of course you've got to be asking yourself, should you be going with Team Red or Team Green for your specific build? For the Xbox Series S, I think the best GPU here would be the GTX 1650 Super. There's just no RTX 3000 series GPU that is just weak enough to fit this performance point. For the PlayStation 5, I think the RTX 3060 would be a decent fit here, though it is a bit weaker at 1440p than the 6600 XT, but it is better at 4K on average. For the Xbox Series X, the 6700 XT is kind of in the middle of two different options. The RTX 3060 Ti is a bit weaker, between 5 and 8% on average, and the RTX 3070 is about 5 to 10% stronger at both 1440p and 4K respectively. And if you're not wanting to go with the 6000 series GPUs from AMD or the 3000 series GPUs from Nvidia, there's quite a few older GPUs that could fit into some of these different slots. The Xbox Series S is interesting. There are a lot of older cards that can fit this type of performance. Some common cards in this performance class would be an RX 580 or a GTX 1060 6GB. The PlayStation 5 is a bit more difficult. 4K leans more on the RTX 2060 Super a bit here, and the 5700 XT. At 1440p, performance is a bit different on Nvidia, and that would probably lean more towards the RTX 2070 Super. Of course, the Xbox Series X is leaning more towards the last generation's high end, with an RTX 2080 Super probably being your closest analog. When it comes to the CPU, there's a lot of different options, but unfortunately, if you're wanting to stick with Gen 4 capability for the GPU as well as the storage solution, you're going to have to go with the 3000 series Ryzen or the 5000 series Ryzen, or if you're going with Intel, you'll need to go with the 11th gen or their 12th gen processors. But if you don't need access to the Gen 4 capabilities, there are a lot of processors and motherboards that should fit your needs. I did a couple different sniff tests with Forza Horizon 5, and I can verify that the 3600, the 3700X, as well as the 5600X hit practically the same performance levels of right around 52 FPS with my RX 6500 XT. So I would imagine if you're going with higher resolutions, you should be fine with any of those types of 6th or 8 core parts. And with all that said, guys, that is my console killer build guide for 2022. If you've guys got any recommendations or some issues with my part selection, let me know down in the comments. As for me, I'm going to be taking my Xbox Series X configuration to DreamHack Dallas next week, where I'm going to be a featured streamer and I'm actually hosting a panel. So if you're interested in seeing some of that stuff, make sure you hit the bell icon and subscribe down below. Check me out on Twitter because I'll be posting all my information over there. But thank you guys for watching the video. Force. We'll catch you in the next one.